Okay, we're just a little past noon, so we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome to the Beaver Watershed Alliance Quarterly Speaker Series. We're really excited for today's program. We have Theo Witsell. He's going to talk about the natural history and ecology of the Northwest Arkansas Ozarks. Before we get started though, we did want to just talk a little bit about the speaker series. The Alliance is working with a lot of different groups to address conservation objectives, including reducing the amount of sediment and nutrients that are entering our streams, improving fish habitat, and reducing flooding. These are all essential services to Northwest Arkansas. Beaver Lake does supply 1 in 6 Arkansans, that's nearly 500,000 people, with clean drinking water, and provides over $128 million annually in tourism and recreation dollars for the economy. So the Alliance developed this speaker series to share the rationale behind investing in watershed protection that's going to benefit our future of the entire region. And there's a direct tie really between today's topic of natural history and ecology. So there's just a direct tie between water quality and the health of our natural infrastructure. So natural infrastructure being our forests, our prairies, our riparian corridors, lakes, and streams. So before we introduce Theo, just a few housekeeping notes. So today's session is going to be recorded and shared on our YouTube. If you have a question, I think we're going to wait till the end for those, and you can just raise your hand and we'll answer those live. We also have a survey at the end, so please take a moment and fill that out so we can continue to improve our programming. Okay, so just a few slides on the Beaver Watershed Alliance here. Let's see. Okay. So our mission is to proactively protect, enhance, and sustain water quality in the Beaver Lake and the integrity of its watershed. And we do that through education and outreach, technical assistance, and planning and analysis. We have a staff of 7, and each of us has a unique skill set to help bring different skills for watershed management topics. So we have a specialized team. And we're also governed by a 20-member board. And again, as mentioned, Beaver Lake is a drinking water source for 500,000 people in Arkansas. It also serves as a hydroelectric power for the region. And again, it's a big recreation draw economically. It's a cornerstone of community growth and development here. So Beaver Lake, if you're not familiar with where we're located, is in the Northwest Arkansas area here. And it's really the first watershed area, the headwaters of the White River system that starts here in the western part of the state. And the White River is actually dammed up a couple of times before it reaches the Mississippi River on the east side of the state. And Beaver Lake itself is located in the Ozark Highlands and Boston Mountains of Northwest Arkansas, which Theo will go into a little more detail on that later. And the Corps did dam up the White River back in the 60s for flood control and drinking water. And this is a large watershed area. It's over 1,192 square miles. Some key features in this area are steep slopes. We have springs coming from the ground to form tributaries, and we have a karst geology, meaning a lot of cave network systems underground. This watershed is dominated by forest with a lot of pasture land too. And the Beaver watershed is a state priority watershed because some of the segments in this watershed area do not meet water quality standards. And according to our strategy, which is a 9-element EPA plan, we've identified some of those areas for sediment reduction needs, which are mostly in the western portion of the watershed. You see there in the red, and most of that's coming from stream bank erosion, unpaved roads, and construction site runoff. So really the Alliance is seeking solutions. We want to learn what's working in this area. What are some things that we can do, some land management practices that not only help water quality, but also benefit people too. So we're working diligently with many communities and landowners to seek those solutions and implement ways and practices that help improve water quality. And one of the key things is strong partnerships. So without our partners, we wouldn't be able to do this work. So we just want to take a moment and thank all of our partners that do support the Beaver Watershed Alliance, both financially and in-kind support. So thank you to our partners. And if you have questions after the program today, we encourage you to contact us. Here's an email for us, our phone number. We also have a Facebook and an Instagram and a podcast. We are Water, and our YouTube channel. So there's many ways to connect with us socially. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Nate Weston is here with us today, and he's going to be introducing our guest speaker today.
All right. Well, hello everyone. My name is Nate Weston, and Becky, thanks for the introduction. I'm a geospatial ecologist with the Alliance, and a lot of folks wonder what that means. Basically, I'm an ecologist who specializes in analyzing environmental factors like plant animal communities, man-made features like roads, bridges, developments, natural features like streams, hills, soils, analyzing how those variables interact. So landowners, municipalities, and others can plan land management practices for the best outcome in terms of water quality and overall watershed vitality. And today it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Theo Witsell. He's our guest speaker for this quarterly speaker series. I'm sure many of you know who Theo is, but for those who do not and are joining us today, Theo is the ecologist and Chief of Research for the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission, or ANHC. The state agency which is charged with identifying and protecting the state's rare plants, animals, and natural communities. Theo oversees the state's natural heritage program and guides the acquisition and management of the state's system of natural areas. And that's a system comprised of 77 public nature preserves protecting more than 72,000 acres. We do have one of these in our watershed. It's a Devil's Eyebrow Natural Area. It's one of the most botanically diverse places in the entire state. Formerly the agency's botanist, Theo started the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission's herbarium in 2003 and still serves as the curator of the state's herbarium collection. He is also co-editor of the Atlas of Vascular Plants of Arkansas, and that is this rather large book here. I don't know if you can even see that. And he is also co-author of Trees, Shrubs, and Woody Vines of Arkansas. And if you don't have a copy of that book, be sure to pick one up as soon as possible. It's a great book for learning trees and shrubs of the state. In 2018, he co-founded and serves as the Chief Ecologist for the Southeastern Grasslands Initiative, which is headquartered at the Center of Excellence for Field Biology at Peay State University in Clarksville, Tennessee. SGI works to identify and conserve the Southeast United States historic and rapidly disappearing grasslands. And this is a very special pleasure for me. I had the pleasure of interning under Theo during my last year of college at University of Central Arkansas. Went on to work at ANHC as a research assistant GIS technician before moving up here to Northwest Arkansas and working my first big person job here with the Alliance. And just to reiterate some things Becky said, I will be moderating questions in the chat box. We'll try to answer questions in person at the end of the presentation so Theo can focus on his presentation. If you have questions you'd prefer answered in person, use the raise hand feature. That's found through the reactions button on the bottom of your screen. And alternatively, you can type questions in the chat box. I'll try to answer as many of those questions as I can. And if I cannot, we'll defer to Theo at the end of the presentation. And just a reminder, this is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. And with that, I believe we are ready to get going. Theo, do you believe you're ready?
I am. Thank you.
All right. Take it away.
Thanks, everyone, for joining today. I am going to mute my video just because it makes the it kind of tends to give more bandwidth to the graphics. So I'll turn back on at the end. Okay, so I'm going to talk about natural history and ecology of the Ozarks, and in particular, that part of the Ozarks in Northwest Arkansas, concentrated on Benton and Washington counties. And I wanted to kind of tell you about part of the reason that I'm, I guess, qualified to talk about that is I'm in the process of the Natural Heritage Commission are in the process of doing our first ever what we call a county natural heritage inventory. And this is a 3-year study of Benton and Washington County. We got some funding from the Walton Family Foundation, matched with some state funding, to sort of do just what the name says. It's an inventory of what the biological diversity, ecological diversity of those counties is. And then also sort of looking at where are the most critical conservation needs and where are the best conservation opportunities. Most of you live in Northwest Arkansas, I assume, and so I don't have to tell you that this is one of the most rapidly developing regions of the country. A statistic I've been told by a number of reputable sources is they've been adding 1,000 people or more per month for the last decade, and that is a lot of people. So in a very real sense, it really is the last chance to do some meaningful conservation of biological diversity in those two counties in particular. So that's where we sort of are focusing a lot of our staff resources and contract resources as well right now. These county inventories, there's going to be a big report that's released at the end of 2022 that sort of summarizes the findings of this study. And it's got sort of 5 main components here. And I'm going to talk about sort of where we are on some, or provide some information that will be in the report, sort of on the ecological history and some status of the biological diversity as we go through today. But one of the main things we hope it does is to provide policymakers, planners, any groups like the Beaver Watershed Alliance with some information that they can use to be strategic in how they apply their resources so they get the biggest bang for the buck in the effort. This is a cool map just showing biodiversity hotspots. So, you know, biological diversity, species of plants and animals, natural habitats or communities are not uniformly distributed. They're very much concentrated in what we call hotspots. And if you look at Arkansas there, you can see particularly the Interior Highlands, which is the sort of northwestern half of the state, really stands out on this map. And in particular, the Ouachita Mountains down south do, but so do this particular region of the Ozark Plateaus, which is in northwestern Arkansas, really centered on Benton County. So there's very real global significance to your region there. And this is another similar map showing sort of hotspots of plant diversity. And also it has that as well. That same pattern. You see this Ozark endemism zone that sort of stands out among other areas of the mid-continent. And that's important. And the reason why there's this pattern on all these maps that you can find is for a particular ecological region there called the Interior Highlands. This is sort of the island of high, elevated, rocky ground in the central part of the continent. It has a unique geology. It's an old land surface, so it's accumulated a lot of interesting species over time. There are a number of species of plants and animals that are found only there and nowhere else in the world. And that gives it sort of that global significance. There's also some interesting things about the geology of parts of it that I'll talk more about. Anytime we want to understand biodiversity, it's important to consider it not at political boundaries. You know, plants and animals could care less about our state borders and that sort of thing, but they're very much, there are some very real patterns on the ground based on these ecological divisions. And this part of the world, particularly the Interior Highlands, is split into 4 major ecoregions or ecological regions that really come to bear when we discuss things like biodiversity. Those are the Ozark Plateaus, which Becky spoke about earlier. The Boston Mountains, she also mentioned. Together, these are the Ozarks, right? So this is, two pretty different areas really, but sort of allied. They're all plateau surfaces and formed or uplifted by the same geological processes in the past. It's also the Arkansas Valley and the Washita's, which I won't talk about today. This is a cool shaded relief map sort of showing the terrain of these ecoregions, and you can really see the difference, especially between the Ozark Plateaus section of the Ozarks and the Boston Mountains. The Boston Mountains are higher, they're more rugged, some real geologic differences there. It's mostly acidic, not entirely, but mostly so, compared to the more calcareous or alkaline rich geology of the Ozark Plateaus. And these are plateaus. They're a series of sort of flat tablelands that have since been dissected and cut by streams and rivers. And so we call them mountains, and certainly there's mountainous terrain, especially in the Bostons. But unlike, say, the Washita's or the Appalachians, they weren't formed by crunching and folding of the geology and upthrusting. They were formed by the whole plateau region being uplifted and then cut away by streams. And one of the consequences of this is when you look at the geology, you can see, like, for example, the sandstone bluff in the lower right part of the picture, that same elevation, miles and miles across the river valleys, you see the same geologic surface at roughly the same elevation. And you see that typically, the geology is a stack of pancakes, basically, that have then been cut away by streams and rivers. And where the original high surface of the plateau is still present, it's uniform in elevation, more or less, roughly, across the landscape. But in many places, it's been cut down below that level by the streams and rivers, and you have sort of isolated knobs or hills or mountains and things like that. We further subdivide those big major ecoregions into what we call the level 4 ecoregions. These are sort of a more fine cut of that. And we split the Bostons just into 2, and they're based on some geological factors, but also elevation. Not very imaginative names, the upper and lower Boston Mountains. And then the Ozark Highlands are split in Arkansas into these different regions here. And then specifically the area I'm talking about today, we really have 5 of these level 4 ecoregions, both parts of the Bostons in Washington County, and then Benton County and the rest of Washington County is entirely in the Ozark Highlands, but it does include 3 important ecoregions that are very different. The Springfield Plateau, which is the high flat tablelands, the dissected Springfield Plateau, which is that same ecoregion, but cut away and more rugged and hilly. And then the White River Hills, which is ecologically and geologically quite distinct, that's over along the White River itself, around Beaver Lake and extending off north into Missouri. And that has some different ecological communities I'll talk about. This is a cool resource that we have now. This is hill-shade LiDAR imagery. This is shot from an airplane using laser beams that scan the surface of the ground, and you can subtract away buildings and trees and all this thing and just look at the actual landforms there. And this is a very useful data set for ecologists working. It's really revolutionized in the last 2-3 years the kind of work we're doing, where we're trying to understand the landscape and find interesting places. But you can see that there's some parts of the Springfield Plateau that are pretty flat, gently rolling. The more dissected lands are pretty cut. And then you can see the White River Hills in extreme, northeastern Benton County, more rugged still. And then the Boston Mountains down in Washington County, higher elevation, more rugged, and a different shape, a different morphology or landform to those mountains because of that different geology. Another useful resource that helps us understand the vegetation, especially of an area, are these infrared or color infrared aerial photographs, this aerial imagery. These are shot from airplanes as well. They have the normal color spectrum in there, but they also have an infrared band that lets us see some things about the vegetation. For example, this is a winter image, and I'll show a lot of these through the talk. And these winter images are shot when most of the native vegetation, of course, is dormant, right? So we don't have a lot of evergreen flora in Arkansas. Of course, there's pine trees and cedar trees and things like that. And a lot of our grassland vegetation, the native grassland vegetation, goes dormant in the winter. So when you take a winter image with the infrared film, anything that's green or growing is shades of red or pink. And that allows us to really make some judgments about the vegetation. That's pretty interesting. So a little about that. The sort of, you can see on here forest versus open lands, grasslands. And that's another really important thing that we see on the ground today, but that goes back thousands of years. I'm going to talk a lot about the grassland heritage in particular of Northwest Arkansas here. Looking, what do these landforms mean on the ground? So this is a shot taken from an airplane. This is actually a little bit further to the east. This is over in northeastern Newton County, looking up into like to Boone County, or no, sorry, looking south into Newton County from the Boone County border. And it shows the Springfield Plateau in the foreground, this sort of gently rolling, flattish landscape. And really historically not so wooded. These areas were dominated by open prairies and open savannas, or oak barrens as they were called historically in a lot of the early literature and the survey records, and then open woodlands. So, space between the trees, a rich herbaceous ground cover of vegetation. And the more rugged parts, the dissected Springfield Plateau, the Boston Mountains, where it was more rugged, were more wooded. That's where you found denser forests or more closed woodland. And I'm going to talk about woodland and forests as two different types of wooded habitat, with woodlands being more open and forests being more closed. And each of those, of course, have a natural place in the landscape. Now, this photo is taken closer to Fayetteville. This is looking south from the Springfield Plateau and near Farmington into the Boston Mountains. And you can see that same thing again, though the herbaceous ground cover vegetation is probably all non-native for the most part in this photograph. You still get that character, that feel of what those plains were like historically. Much more open, scattered thickets of trees along the streams, but prairie savanna as a major component of the landscape, while the more rugged mountainous land was more wooded. And these ecoregions are split out based on a number of different things, not just geology and landform, also the biological communities, the vegetation, but the geology and the structure of the ground, the landforms are a major part of it. This is the upper Boston Mountains, very rugged, lots of cliffs and bluffs, these bluff-lined hollows. The upper Boston's is high elevation, high enough that the rainfall is higher than in the lower Bostons because of orographic lifting of the air. It gets cool and releases moisture at that higher elevation. It is, of course, cooler up there. Dominated, this is the same image in an infrared aerial, dominated by hardwoods, hardwood woodland and forest. Dense mesic forest down below the bluff lines in these deep hollows. These are some of our richest kind of moist forest, not a lot of grassland type elements. This is very much, true forest communities down in these rugged hollows of the Boston Mountains. Now, you might be very different on a mountaintop 1,000 feet in elevation higher in a dry sort of post oak woodland, but not a lot of pine trees. The pine you're seeing in this photograph, a little bit of that's probably natural, like say, I don't know if you can see my cursor down here. That looks kind of like a natural pine component, but then these, like up in the upper right of the photo, that's an old field that was put to pine. Very different landscape. Now, the lower Bostons, also rugged, but not as much, not as rugged as the upper Bostons, and geologically a little different, also a lot drier because of that lower elevation and that more southern aspect to the general trend of the plateau surface sloping to the south. You get more pine, and this is a true color winter image showing the amount of shortleaf pine woodland down in, this is at Long Pool Rec area on the Big Piney, not in Benton or Washington County, but similar. Now, the lower Bostons in Benton and Washington County don't have quite the pine component as you get further east, but overall that. The dissected Springfield Plateau typically looks like this, very different landform. Is a mix of hardwood and pine in some areas. If you go to Hobbs State Management Area or State Park Conservation Area on the south side of Beaver Lake, that's the epicenter of pine in Northwest Arkansas. And you get, this photo wasn't taken there, but you'll get a very similar view with a lot of pine, on the south-facing upper slopes and west-facing upper slopes there. And then the White River Hills have a different landform altogether. This is actually the lower Buffalo River, where it flows into the White in southern Marion County. But this is sort of similar to what you might have seen had Beaver Lake not been built. And you could see the landforms in that country over in northeastern Benton County. You would see something similar to this, and a mix of forest, woodland, and glades. I'm going to talk a lot about glades as we get into that. But these non-biological variables of the landscape have a great bearing on the vegetation, on the natural communities, plant communities that we find. And this is a pretty cool map of some plant community or vegetation modeling of what we call the potential natural vegetation, historical vegetation of Benton and Washington County. Pretty coarsely cut, but still pretty interesting. You can see the differences, and they really correspond a lot with those ecological regions I talked about. And among these are some really important plant habitats. So we have this great grassland element, especially on the Springfield Plateau, but in a few other areas. We have all sorts of types of wetlands. I'm going to talk about glades and savannas and woodlands, these mesic forests I mentioned. Rare types of wetlands like sinkhole ponds and fens, which are a type of spring-fed wet meadow. We did have bottomland forest type systems along some of the major rivers. Of course, a lot of those are now under Beaver Lake. We do have some on the Illinois River and a little bit left on the White. They're riparian or streamside natural communities. And I'm going to talk some about cliffs and talus or bluff communities, highly interesting. And on any of these landforms, if you want to understand what you're seeing, it's really useful to get this sort of context by what are the things that influence biodiversity, and starting with vegetation on a given site. There's things like where it is in the world, the direction that it slopes, how steep it is. The aspect is that direction that a site faces. South-facing slope, very different than a north-facing slope in terms of its vegetation. The hydrology, what kind of water is there? How long is it there? What's the source of it? What's its chemistry? The landform, which I've talked a lot about already, soils and geology, the climate, the weather, the canopy density, if it's a wooded community, the disturbance regimes, both past and present, the landscape context, the surrounding land use. In an urban environment, your vegetation is going to be largely non-native anymore, especially in larger communities like Fayetteville, Rogers, Bentonville, Springdale. A lot of what you find today in the woods or in the grasslands is not native. And that came from that history of human occupation over the last 150, 200 years. And then the past land use, what's happened on a site historically. And just like biodiversity is not uniformly distributed over the broad landscape, it's the same thing at the local level. On a given tract of land that you might be interested in or that you might own or be working on, you can very much expect hotspots within that for biological diversity. And part of our work in protecting biodiversity and conservation of natural resources is to understand where those hotspots are and make sure that those are given a little extra consideration in terms of development or planning or management. And this is just an example showing different microhabitats or patch communities, we'll call them, within a larger area. And then you get these obvious patterns you see on the landscape. I talk about south and north facing slopes. That's a big deal. Where you have acidic geology, you typically have a very pine rich, assuming you have pine in that ecosystem, you have sort of a pine rich south facing slope. It's hotter and drier. The sun is always in the southern half of the sky at our latitude. So you get these very different sort of levels of sun exposure on a south facing slope and a north facing slope. So you get things like shortleaf pine, post oak, blackjack oak, these drought tolerant, dry loving oaks, and hickories like black hickory on those south facing slopes. But you go over to the north facing slope and you get totally different things. You'll get things like white oak, red oak, northern red oak, mockernut hickory. And if you get down to lower slopes, sometimes you get things like basswood or beech, magnolia, some of these real mesic species. Becky also mentioned that Northwest Arkansas is a karst region, especially the Ozark Highlands ecoregion, where we have lots of groundwater movement. We have lots of cave and karst things underground. And that's a big influence. A lot of the rarest biodiversity, for example, is found in caves, and they're fascinating. They're a high priority for conservation and exploration. Of course, groundwater moves through caves and feeds our human water sources, and sensitive to pollution, of course, as she mentioned earlier. There's also a lot of rare biodiversity. Some of the rarest species in the world are found in Northwest Arkansas in caves and karst. Things like these blind endemic cave crayfish and Ozark cavefish, some of our rarest species. A lot of cave invertebrates are rare, sometimes known from a single site in the world, high conservation priorities. Also, of course, bats. A lot of the cave bats are exceedingly rare today. They've been hammered by all sorts of factors, from habitat destruction to now we have the white nose syndrome, fungal pathogen that's really wiping them out in many areas. We have several really rare bats that use caves in Northwest Arkansas: the Ozark big-eared bat, gray bat, Indiana bat, northern long-eared bat. Some cave obligate are found only in caves, and other vertebrates like these grotto salamanders. And the LIDAR is blowing the lid off our understanding of cave and karst. So this is just a picture I like to show. Nate mentioned Devil's Eyebrow Natural Area, which is one of our big preserves on the north side of Beaver Lake, up near Gateway and Garfield. And we got about 3,600 acres protected there now over the last 10 years or so. And as we were working up there, I spent over a month on the ground, walking out all the hollows and looking for caves and looking for rare species and taking inventory of all the species that we could find. And we found several caves. We thought we'd done a pretty good job. But then this LIDAR imagery comes out, and here is a major cave feature. You can see this, there's a stream here flowing, headwaters here, and it sort of flows to the west, and it just disappears down this hole. There's a bluff line here, and then a stream picks up and heads southwest further down. We had no idea that even existed. That doesn't show up on a topographic map, or it's not visible in an aerial photo, but on the LIDAR, it stands out like a sore thumb. You can see these features that we had no awareness of before. And it allows us, even on sites that we own and have protected and know about, it allows us to find out new things without even leaving the office. It's pretty amazing time to be doing this kind of work. And then there's a sinkhole right here, if you can see that across the valley, that we could not have seen even on a topographic map, because it's not deep enough to have shown up. And sometimes these karst and cave systems influence the topography of the ground and the ecology of the terrestrial or above ground world. And this is a great example. These are some of our rarest types of wetlands. These are sinkhole ponds. They're natural collapses of the land surface that pond water from precipitation. These are ancient wetlands, very rare in Arkansas. Arkansas was never glaciated, so we don't have like a lot of natural ponds and lakes, other than, say, big lakes in oxbow meander scars on major rivers in the eastern part of the state and along the Arkansas River, places like that. We have a little of that in the Ozarks as well, but very little upland natural ponds, especially these ancient ponds that could be tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years old, have time to accumulate an interesting biological community. Very high interest to our agency and others doing conservation work. And the LIDAR has allowed us to really find these again. So used to be, we had topo maps, and we would look at a site like this little pond here in the center of the photo, and we'd say, hey, that's a pretty big pond up on the top of a mountain on a saddle up there. That could be a natural sinkhole pond. We look at the aerial photo and be like, wow, yeah, that looks like that might be a natural feature. But then we have the LIDAR, which can show us a few inches of elevation change, and we see, no, in fact, there's a clear earthen berm that was put on that. That's an artificial surface. And when these are old and they're covered in forest, you really can't tell at all without something like this. So this is maybe 60, 70 years old or something. It's not an ancient natural pond. But in contrast, this is a site over near Garfield in Benton County called Pond Mountain. And that got my interest, looking at the the topographic map, it says Pond Mountain, and there's a symbol there below the word mountain that shows a marsh symbol. And that made me think, wow, if it's named Pond Mountain, presumably by early settlers, and it's showing a marsh up there, that could be a natural depression pond. And look at the aerial photograph, and sure enough, it's showing a wet area there. And then looking on the LiDAR, there's no artificial impoundment whatsoever. There's no road going in there, no scars of it being dug out. That's pretty clearly a natural sinkhole depression pond, and that could be very ancient in age and have some pretty interesting things. Have not been to that site on the ground, haven't gotten permission, but it is the kind of thing that gets our interest. The site you want to check out. One of the things we do at Natural Heritage is we have the Natural Heritage Database, and that's the database of occurrences of the species of conservation concern for the state. And we share this widely with other agencies, and we have a data sharing agreement with timber companies and all sorts of people that use this for planning and stewardship. We use it for conservation planning, deciding what lands we're going to go after for the system of natural areas. Because we have such a limited resources, we want to be very strategic. But this lets us, share data with other people to help them make good decisions for conservation. That's the upshot of why we have this. And this is the Benton and Washington County locations of some of these rare species. And we map those not only as points, but we can map, for example, if something occurs around the margin of a pond, we can actually draw around the margin of the pond and represent occurrences somewhat accurately, as good as we can. Major things to know about Northwest Arkansas. There is a heavy grassland component to the natural history there, to the natural heritage. Prior to European settlement, there was well over at least 70,000 acres of treeless prairies, tall grass prairies in Benton and Washington counties. And this map, I'll talk a little more about how it was made in a minute. But we know this is a lowball estimate, and there's several reasons why. It was made from the original land survey of the Louisiana Purchase, which began in 1815 and did Northwest Arkansas probably in the 1830s. But this was essentially before major widespread catastrophic changes to the landscape. So we know, these were natural grasslands, but really, much of the other area in this topographic map that you see as white, which is mostly the surface of the Springfield Plateau, and at least in the northern half of Washington County and Benton County, that's the surface of the Springfield Plateau. Much of that was really savanna, scattered trees, and really a grassland in itself as well. And these natural communities have almost completely vanished from the landscape. They've been converted to other uses long ago. They've been plowed for agriculture. They've been converted to fescue pasture. They've been paved over. And a big thing that's happened is without fire, which was a natural component of the landscape up there, a lot of them have grown up into very low quality, low diversity, thickety forests. And recovering areas that can still respond and still have the grassland plants hanging on, recovering them back to open grassland, open savanna is a major conservation priority. So I'm going to talk a fair amount about that. These grasslands are extremely rich in biodiversity, disproportionately diverse, and a whole bunch of the rare things that are of concern today are found in those grassland remnants and areas where that the biology or the species haven't completely gone away, but they're all very rare today. So that's a big deal. Probably the surface of the Springfield Plateau had a lot of areas that looked like this in this photograph. And that area in the foreground is a saline slick. It's a naturally barren, salty area that we still have a few examples of. This is on Fort Chaffee in the Arkansas Valley, adjacent to a big bombing range. And that's a rare grassland in the foreground called a saline barrens. And then past that is tall grass prairie, oak savanna, oak woodland, and forest along the creeks. And there's tens of thousands of acres of this kind of habitat left on Fort Chaffee. And this is clearly sort of what was in these big grassland plateau surface areas. You get a lot of stuff that looks like this as the land starts to break. and become more dissected. You get sort of this open savanna woodland transition zone. Here's a post oak savanna woodland on Fort Chaffee, still with the natural ground cover left. This was never plowed for agriculture or grazed out by cattle intensively. Sort of a time machine look at what Northwest Arkansas, Springfield Plateau looked like 200 years ago, probably. And part of the natural heritage inventory that I've been working on is to dive into the historical accounts that mention natural features and natural conditions of the landscape. So wonderful quotes that we've dug up talking about how much things have changed. This is a quote from 1880s talking about how much land had changed in the previous 60 years since the 1820s. When the pioneers first came, there were large areas of prairie which are covered with a more or less dense growth of timber 60 years later by 1880s. The site of Fayetteville and several of the surrounding elevations, as well as the intervening valleys, were bare of timber and were covered with luxuriant growth of grasses, which afforded excellent pasturage for the buffaloes and other herbivorous animals like elk, deer, etc. There's another quote here. I don't have time to read all of these, but they talk about extensive savannas. The timber was then very thin. The trees stood far apart, and the country, which is now covered with a dense growth of young timber, was then so open that you could see deer for several hundreds of yards. A lot of great quotes like this. Also some great quotes about the original fauna that was there at the time of European contact and settlement. Talking about all the wolves and panthers and bears and things that were in that region. There's some great quotes from right around Fayetteville and Prairie Grove and places that lay all this out. Talking about Sylvanus Blackburn seeing 2 bison shortly after he settled in 1832, perhaps the last ones, etc. And other ones. This is a great quote. I'll read this one and then probably be done. But my first acquaintance with the valley, this is the valley around, this would be in the Illinois watershed over around Prairie Grove. The buffalo was in 1829. The buffalo had then receded some 15 or 20 miles to the northwest. Their paths were still numerous. So they talk about these bison trails, which are now roadways. I mean, they were bison trails, then they were Native American trails, then they were roads, etc. Okay. Leading from one lick to another. I talk about those salt licks. Their heads or their skulls were scattered all over the prairies, one perhaps to every 3 acres of land. These licks were depressions in the earth filled with a little brackish water in wet weather. In summer, when dry, they were the resorts of buffalo for the salt with which the earth was saturated, and were known as buffalo licks. And then there's this other quote about Frank Pierce coming up the White River within 2 miles of Fayetteville and discovering a herd of bison. This is something else I found. This is basically in eastern Fayetteville now. This is the White River shown here. This is a map from the original land survey, so 1830s. We still use these same section lines here. That's our public land survey grid. This is along the White River, about 1.5 miles upstream from Lake Sequoia. And they mapped a bison lick, a buffalo lick there, and that's in someone's yard now. So I did look to see, maybe I could go look at that and see if that's any vestige of it remaining, but it's likely all gone. We also dug into the historical museum record and found a lot of really interesting and very rare grassland plants that were collected in the early days. Here's some specimens of the Illinois tick trefoil, which is a prairie species. We don't have any sites anymore in Arkansas for this that we know of, collected in 1945 near Decatur, and then again in the 70s near Decatur on a virgin prairie and a railroad right-of-way that's now wooded. Here's a specimen from 1883 of an extremely rare and beautiful, I should have had a picture of it in flower, a rare false foxglove, Northwest Arkansas prairies, 1883. No sites for this anymore. This is the only record of this we know of, again from the late 1800s, from Skinner's false foxglove, prairies and woods, Northwest Arkansas. Don't have any sites for that anymore. They also mapped, as the surveyors went across the survey grid in the 1830s, they mapped precisely where they entered and left these prairies on the section line that they were riding their horse or walking down. And we have these maps that they created on the original plat maps, and we've digitized those now. That's where that map came from I showed before. But again, it's a low ball estimate. If there was a prairie, it could be several hundred acres in size, but not be crossed by one of these section lines, and they would not have documented it. And we know that some surveyors mapped a prairie right to the boundary of their the township they were working on, and the surveyor in the next section didn't finish it. And we see that here. Here's a prairie mapped down in this southern part, and then it goes over the line, and they just show where it was, but they don't finish it out. And we've seen that a lot of times, but it's still a great resource. If you want to understand the ecology of these areas, you got to think about grasslands. And there's an excellent book that I can't recommend highly enough that came out about 10 years ago by Reed Noss called Forgotten Grasslands of the South. It includes Arkansas. He compiles in a sort of popular format this wide bunch of information from a ton of different scientific disciplines about grasslands and our grassland heritage in the South, in the Southeast in particular. And it has changed the way I see the landscape. It's changed the way a lot of, and not just his book, but just the information in it has changed the way that we sort of consider what's happened on the landscape in the last couple hundred years. Historically, these prairies were big and they were awesome, and they had tons and tons of diversity in them. This is an example of that, of a remnant that has never been destroyed, never been plowed. 99.9+% of these are gone in the last 200 years, in the last 150 years, really. This is a remnant. It is an ancient old growth grassland. It's thousands of years old. This is a Cherokee or Flanagan Prairie, Flanagan Prairie Natural Area in the Arkansas Valley. There's a couple of remnants like this in Northwest Arkansas. There's Chesney and Searles Prairie. There's a privately owned remnant called Stump Prairie. And that's about all that's left that's protected. There's a few other small ones that are not protected and in severe need of protection. These are the last places in Arkansas for a lot of different species. And they are disproportionately diverse. It's amazing. We call them tall grass prairies, primarily for 4 species of tall grasses, although this is a tiny fraction of the grass species that are known from these grasslands. But they're sort of the keystone or backbone species that you're likely to recognize, both for their size and their abundance. These are switchgrass, Indian grass, big blue stem, or turkeyfoot, and little blue stem. And these are widespread in our remnant grasslands across the Ozarks. This is Baker Prairie Natural Area, another ancient remnant. It's one of the last chert prairies in Arkansas. It's certainly a very high quality remnant. This is in Harrison and Boone County. But there's similar types of geology. A chert prairie recently found in Benton County. That's a remnant. It's not as big as this or quite as high quality, but it's still important. Very diverse. Lots of species found in these remnants that are nowhere else. This is a sort of a flat, seasonally wet plain prairie, also in the Arkansas Valley at Cherokee Prairie. There was extensive areas of this habitat historically in Benton and Washington County. And we know of a few examples of this. This is probably our rarest type of prairie left in Arkansas. It's a groundwater fed seepage prairie. We know of 2 surviving examples of this. They're both in the Arkansas Valley and Franklin County, but we know for sure that there were historically examples of this around Rogers and around Siloam Springs. We have plant specimens in the museum record from the 1800s and even up into the 1950s that were species that are only found in this super rare natural community of groundwater fed prairie. And they were collected, and they described it as a seepy prairie, springy prairie, that kind of stuff on the specimen label. But to our knowledge, there's no surviving remnants of this habitat in Arkansas outside of these 2 ones in Franklin County. Lots of very, very rare species here. Each one of these is different. This is another shot of that seepage prairie. And then, these remnants, they have things that are nowhere else, and they have almost unbelievable levels of species richness sometimes. They're the product of thousands of years of sorting and accumulation of species over time. They're ancient ecosystems. And the prairies are really well known and loved for the rich diversity of wildflowers. And again, there's a lot of these that are found pretty much only in this habitat or primarily in this habitat. We have a bunch of species of blazing star. We got 2 species of Indian paintbrush, dozens and dozens of beans and peas. We have 5 species of echinacea in our grasslands, 21 native milkweeds. This is compass plant. It's a sunflower relative. There's a group of the rosin weeds and compass plants that we have. There's a bunch of beard tongues, 8 or 9 black-eyed Susans, 3 meadow beauties, 16 native sunflowers, 5 species of false indigo or baptisia. There's another milkweed. And another thing about them is they're not just plants. These native remnant grasslands have incredible animal diversity, especially invertebrate diversity. A lot of species of invertebrates need specific species of plants or specific families or genera of plants. And a lot of these are found in grasslands. And there's endemic insects that are found only in grasslands. And of course, these insects and other invertebrates are a food source for all sorts of other animals, right? So the grassland birds, which as a group are the worst off of all the bird groups. They're really rich, and a lot of those depend on insects. There's all sorts of grassland animals that are found only in grasslands. This is a Graham's crayfish snake, a crawfish frog, an indigo bunting in the middle there. There's other species of birds, bobwhite quail, monarch butterflies. All of these are found not only in grasslands necessarily. Some of them are found only in grasslands, but these are our grassland animals. This is a rare one. This is the ornate box turtle, our rarest of the 2 species of box turtle by far. It's found only in prairies and in areas that were prairie historically. It's a grassland turtle, very different than the common three-toed that you see. It's a species of concern. There's a whole bunch of rare burrowing crayfish that are found only in wet grasslands. And they live in these chimneys, they make these big chimneys and they burrow down to the water table. These prairies are seasonally wet for the most part, at least if they're flat. And they have a clay pan that holds a high water table. It's part of the reason they're prairies and not forests, or were historically prairies and not forests. But there's some really rare ones. This is the Osage burrowing crayfish, which is found primarily in Arkansas in prairies and primarily in Benton and Washington County, although it does range outside that. And, we have enough rainfall in Arkansas that you would expect forest everywhere, but it's clearly not the case. We had extensive grasslands historically, millions of acres. And the reason why is there's usually some soil factor sort of enabling the prairie. And then there's some ecosystem process that used to function on the landscape that was responsible for maintaining it as grassland or savanna. And these, primarily the big one was fire, but also these bison, these elk that we used to have in huge herds had a major impact on the landscape. Of course, that's been removed entirely from the equation. And fire pretty much has, except where we choose to put it back as a management tool to restore and manage these areas. In the Springfield Plateau in particular, there's a bunch of different types of grassland, everything from dry, rocky prairie to wet marsh, and these groundwater fed wetlands and so on. And then there's a bunch of types of open woodlands and savannas that are allied, and they all sort of grade into one another in this rich sort of mosaic of natural communities. Just a few quick pictures. These dry prairies are different than the more mesic or moist prairies. They're different than the wet marshes. Here's some rare species, especially this lower left here, the Oklahoma grass pink orchid, found only in ancient prairie remnants, extremely rare in anywhere today, especially in Arkansas, known from just a handful of sites, including several of these remnants in Benton and Washington, or in Benton County. I don't think there's any sites remaining in Washington County that we know of. In each of these natural communities, the different types of grassland have their own suite of species that are found in them, that are dominant in them, and some rare ones that are found only in them. No 2 prairies are alike. This is one of my favorite natural areas. It's a sad little story. In some ways, it's a sad little place. This is Searles Prairie Natural Area. We recently added a couple of acres to it, but it was about 8.5 acres. And it's the last piece of a 20,000 acre prairie that occurred between Rogers and Bentonville, the last piece in really high quality condition. And it's such a small little place. And when we got it, it was still sort of in a semi-rural context of a little flock, and there was more prairies around and fields and open ground. And you look at that today, and it's just a little island in a sea of development, pretty much. And there's a few other places nearby that it could be protected, but the land values are so high to purchase and protect land there. The little bit we got next to this was the most expensive acquisition we've ever bought. And Searles Prairie itself, we actually is privately owned, and we have a conservation easement from the family that did us all a service by agreeing to protect that site. It is the only site in the state for at least 2 species of plants. These 2 rare sedges, which are wet grassland obligates found in no other habitat, Carex conoidea and Carex buxbaumii. These sedges are known nowhere else in the state, but are, have nice populations there on the Searles Prairie. And the coolest thing about these is we had no idea we were there that these were there when we protected this site. These were found 30 years after the site was protected, and we had no idea. So it was like, wow, this is, these were here. Like, they would be gone if we hadn't protected that. And then there's marsh. Historically, there was a lot of really wet, marshy spots in these prairies. And they, of course, have their own groups of plants and animals that live in those and are not found in other habitats. And these are largely converted. They've either grown up in ash trees or some other wet forest, or they've been drained. A lot of times they've just been drained away or paved over and filled. And they have their own biodiversity. Another characteristic of these grassland areas across the Springfield Plateau are the presence of these little things called pimple mounds. And you've probably seen these if you've driven around and looked out through fields and so on. These are these little several foot tall, 30-foot wide, 40-foot wide, sometimes smaller, little lens-shaped mounds, little dunes. They're ancient wind-blown dunes. They're also called nebkas is a scientific name for them, or coppice dunes, and that alludes to how they were formed, which is they were in very arid times, more arid than we have today. You can still see this in the Southwest U.S. is where this upper photo was taken. You can see these sort of how they're formed. The barren areas in the flats lose sediment to wind, and that wind accumulates around clumps of vegetation and forms these dunes. And these happened in the past in these areas that always seem to have a grassland heritage. And then the climate became cooler and more moist over time, and they stabilized with grass. And those areas spent at least some portion of time as a prairie with these prairie mounds or prairie pimples in them. And then sometimes now they're wooded, but they were not wooded when those dunes formed. That's a grassland thing. And they occur in most of our prairie remnants in areas that used to be prairie. And we see certain plant species are found only on or primarily on those pimple mounds. This is a little thing called the mealy fumort. It's a relative of bleeding heart of the forest of the east, if you know that species. And it occurs on these dunes in particular. This is at Chesney Prairie Natural Area there. You can see these in these winter shot images where the wet soil shows up different than the dry soil of the mounds. You can see that there. This is a site near Fayetteville on Clabber Creek, not far from Wilson Springs Preserve, if you know where that is. This is in 1995. And this is the same site in 2014. These areas where we still have the nebkas or the pimple mounds are areas that typically didn't get plowed. If you see big ones that didn't, I mean, we can tell from the LIDAR really if they've ever been plowed. But when you find them that haven't been plowed, there's a good chance that some kind of wet prairie or something resembling a wet prairie can be restored there pretty easily. There's a site near Fayetteville called Woolsey Prairie near the wastewater treatment plant on the west side. And that was a heavily degraded but hanging on wet prairie that had these dune fields, these nebkas in it. And it was covered in fescue grass was the dominant, and they sprayed that and got rid of it and restored the hydrology and 10 years later, there was 400 and something native species of wet prairies on these. And it wasn't the really rare remnant stuff, but it's great habitat. And some of the rare animals have done wonderfully there. Things like the crawfish frog and the Graham's crayfish snake and the Osage burrowing crayfish and lots of rare birds in great numbers at that. And that was the site that still had those mounds. And that's how we can kind of tell if a site might be restorable. But we're losing those opportunities as we're seeing huge areas of these getting developed over. We have several state natural areas that our agency has protected in Northwest Arkansas. These in yellow. I'm going to talk briefly about two of them. Devil's Eyebrow Natural Area is our big one, about 3,640 acres now on the north end of Beaver Lake. And then a new one that we've recently, our newest one up there is the Healing Springs Natural Area, which is southeast of the Northwest Arkansas Airport and is an extremely important wetland site. Here's Devil's Eyebrow. And the goal there was, this was a site that was recognized by botanists in particular as far back as the 1920s as being a really special site. They found all kinds of plants that weren't known from the region there, a lot of really rare things. They commented on the incredible diversity of things there. And a lot of where they were, we think, is actually now under Beaver Lake at the south end of what we've now protected. But we did find most of all the rare things they talked about from the 20s, 30s, 40s. We were able to relocate populations of those in this area. And it spans the divide between that dissected Springfield Plateau ecoregion, which is like this area over on the west. You look at the landforms here, that's dissected Springfield Plateau, and it transitions over to the White River Hills right in here. And you can see the landforms totally different over here on the east side. And that's, these big red areas are glades that are completely filled with invasive cedar trees. And we're doing major restoration projects to remove that cedar and restore those open glady grasslands. I'll talk more about glades in a minute, but we're trying to build a corridor. We've now actually done it. You can walk from the Nature Conservancy's Walton Preserve way over here at the southwest end and go all the way across now on protected land to the Mark Twain National Forest in Missouri. And we chose to work at Devil's Eyebrow because it had this uncommon concentration of high quality habitats and really rare species. A lot of them are globally rare. They're found in a narrow region of the Ozarks and nowhere else in the world. But there's something like 32 species on the state rare plant list found there. There's also some really rare animals of concern, populations of collared lizards, cerulean warblers, northern long-eared bats, and other species as well. It's just a really great area and one of the last opportunities to do protection there. Here's some sites and some of the different habitats at Devil's Eyebrow and some of the management work, restoration work that's gone on there. If you're interested in knowing more about that area and how, we had a specific strategy to protecting that site of how we were going to get grant money and how we were going to work with partners like Beaver Water District, Beaver Watershed Alliance, others that have a vested interest in Beaver Lake. But this was a multi-agency, multi-organization partnership. And it was a major conservation success story for Arkansas. And there was so much interest in how are you able to do that we wrote a paper about it. And that paper was published in the Natural Areas Journal a couple of years back, 2019. The other area I want to talk about briefly is this area at, and then I'm going to talk some about glades also, but I want to talk about this area at Healing Springs. So this area had been heavily altered above, the vegetation had been heavily altered. It was a cattle ranch for a long time. Then it was an exotic animal ranch where they had llamas and red deer and all sorts of different things in this high fence area. The vegetation was heavily damaged by that sort of thing. And as a botanist, I went to look at the site and was pretty unimpressed at first. And I'll say at first, I'll explain why. But we knew it was a super important site for some of the rarest aquatic animal diversity we have in the state. Two of our rarest fish species in Arkansas are the Arkansas darter and the leaf darter. And these are unique and they're rare because they are prairie fish. If you've ever known, that's kind of a weird concept. There's fish that need prairie. Not only do they need prairie, they need spring-fed creeks and ponds with a specific kind of aquatic vegetation located in a prairie or savanna landscape. And not only are they rare as species, there's genetic work going on that's saying maybe at least one of these is distinctly different even from the other populations in other parts of the country to the west, and maybe something that's endemic only to a small region. These are locations we have of these two species in different colors here, overlaid with this prairie. And then of course, if you look at the white in the topographic map there, that's sort of this, what we think was savanna historically. And it's very much correlated to spring-fed wetlands in these areas. For example, this is what we call the Clabber Creek Prairie. This is the interchange in the north side of Fayetteville. This is the Wilson Springs Preserve, is kind of right in here, if you know where that is. You can see all the pimple mounds here. This was a big wet prairie historically and had a lot of springs in it. And these yellow dots are locations of one of those. This is the Arkansas darter in this case. And not only are we finding rare things there, we're watching it get destroyed. So this is a 1995 photograph of that prairie. And here it is just 25 years later, over half houses. And then we're lucky that the Northwest Arkansas Land Trust was able to protect the Wilson Springs Preserve. That's an incredibly important little natural area in town. But even that, it was open savanna and prairie, or open grassland, open condition back in 1995. But through time, quickly after it was protected, it grew up into a dense thicket, and we started to lose or see declines in a lot of the rare species that needed that open wet savanna and prairie. And luckily, the Land Trust is doing some great work going in there and thinning it back out, controlling the vegetation, getting back. This is the spring run in the middle of the picture that has the rare darters in it, and they need that open habitat. So they've gone in and removed some trees and restored some habitat there. This is a unmanaged area on the left of the spring run and a restored area on the right. You can see the difference. Lots of non-native invasive shrubs encroaching in there, but they can restore that back. And it's had a wonderful effect on a bunch of rare species of plants that live there in these spring-fed meadows. And it's been a wonderful success story that we now would like to emulate at Healing Springs Natural Area, which we picked up, which has even more rare aquatic species. This is the site. It was a collaborative project with the Department of Transportation that needed a wetland mitigation site. And we were able to steer them towards this one because it had such important aquatic biodiversity values and needed to be protected. So they were able to buy that and satisfy some of the mitigation requirements from destroying wetlands elsewhere. And they then turned that over to the Natural Heritage Commission, and we've been working to get that restored since. Has some wonderful spring-fed wetlands with certain kinds of aquatic vegetation that are perfect for the rare darters, and lots of other rare fish and crayfish that live there. Lots of rare species. Our aquatic ecologist said it's the single most important site for imperiled aquatic fauna in, I think it probably said Northwest Arkansas, but maybe said in the state. At any rate, it's one of the highest priorities for us in that realm of things that we have. There's also a connection there with the Ozark cavefish, which lives in the groundwater zones below that area of the county, and could well pop out at any time at Healing Springs. There's, in the vegetation I mentioned was highly altered, but there's still these remnant trees left from the old savanna-like habitat that would have been there historically. Hundreds of years old, some of them, like this one on the right, kind of still hanging on out there. And I recently went after cows had been off of the area for 18 months or 2 years, and was amazed at some of the cool things that had popped up, including a very rare spring loving plant species called American brook lime, and also the first records from Benton County for a rare aquatic, uncommon aquatic floating fern called the mosquito fern. The American brook lime was new to Arkansas, was not known at all from the state. And that was a Benton County record there. We also found a large fen, which is this groundwater seepage meadow, rare habitat that we didn't even really know was there because it had been just grazed down to the soil. and by the number of cows that were in there. And it turned out it's coming back, and maybe there's some rare species that could pop up. So we're really trying to restore that habitat. Also found some really interesting native gourds, and I have a whole nother talk I'm working on about this. This is one of 4 crop species that was domesticated in Eastern North America by Native Americans 5,000 years ago. And this is what we think is the wild ancestor to about half the modern squashes and gourds that we get at the grocery store. And a population there on Little Osage Creek around that natural area had 5 distinctly different fruit shapes and types. It was truly amazing. And these gravel bars on these Ozark streams are turning up all kinds of interesting things like this. I got this thing called the peach leaf willow I found on Osage Creek nearby in Benton County a couple months ago, and that was the first record from Arkansas for that rare species. It's more commonly found in the southern Great Plains. I'm going to talk about glades and probably use up the remainder of my time. I might get into forest a little bit. Glades are another of the most important habitats for conservation in the region. If someone asked me to define a glade, I would say a glade is a naturally treeless opening in an otherwise forested environment and it's naturally open because bedrock either comes to the surface or either outcrops or comes close to the surface of the ground. So what you get here is a weird hydrology where it can be very wet part of the year because there's this bedrock right at the soil. And especially if it's a flatter glade, that's the rain comes and it just saturates that soil on top of that rock. But then in the summer, it's absolutely our driest habitat. It's extremely dry. It's a desert-like environment. So this really extreme, seasonally wet and seasonally as dry as it gets, hydrology that goes on there. There was also, it's very thin soil. So most trees have a hard time growing there, at least long-term. They might get started, but then they die in a drought. And then fire was a big component of these. And of course, these grazers and browsers, historically, these animals that are no longer with us, probably also. But they have uncommonly high diversity of species of plants and animals both, and they have huge concentrations of the rarest species, especially of plants. There's the historic prairies in green from the other map. And then these are some glades. So we've done a big project over the last, I think it was completed in 2016, where we worked with some folks in Missouri and at the Central Hardwoods joint venture, and they mapped all the glades in Arkansas from aerial imagery. And there's 9 different types of glades and classified based on the type of geology that they form on. And what you see here are some of the major types. There's basically 4 types that we mapped in Benton and Washington County. And this shows where they're located. I'll talk a little about each one. If you've heard about bald knobs in the Ozarks, that's a landscape feature that used to be common, where there were these treeless knobs and ridges, especially in the White River Hills ecoregion, all up through southern Missouri, parts of northern Arkansas. And there was extensive areas of these sort of weird alien looking landscapes here. And the little lines of trees that you see and shrubs are on little outcrops of rocks. There's little ledges and shelves as you go down. We're looking down on the top of a conical hill, and you can see there's like a central knob, and there's these concentric rings of rock outcroppings and grassland in between. And it's kind of a savanna. This is what a restored glade looks like in Missouri. You can see that sort of on the flanks of these hills. And then the valleys oftentimes have some trees in them. This is one of the most telling photographs that I have in this talk. This is a part of the White River Hills over near Norfolk Lake. So this is a little east of this area I'm talking about today, but it's the same ecoregion, same processes going on. There was no pine in this landscape over in this part of the White River Hills. So all of the red you're seeing is cedar trees. And these cedar trees are native. It's the eastern red cedar, Juniperus virginiana, historically occurred primarily along bottoms, on bluff lines, and in little fire protected microsites. It now has completely filled in hundreds of thousands of acres, maybe more, maybe 1 million acres of formerly open glade savanna type habitat across the region. And that's happened slowly over 100 plus years, and it followed intensive open range grazing, which removed the native grass down to the ground. And then it sort of coincided with the suppression of natural fires that used to burn over these areas sometimes every year, every couple of years, for thousands of years probably. And the combination of that 1-2 punch is that our glade grasslands have almost all been lost to the cedar encroachment. And cedar is one of the few trees that can do well on that thin soil. And a major conservation priority, restoration priority now is to remove the cedar out of these. But we now have this wonderful map that has been produced that shows where these are. So before that, we didn't even have a map of where they were. We could go find them on our own. But now we have this statewide map that shows glades and is now guiding a lot of the restoration work. There's some great quotes from the glade country. I don't have time to read them, but they describe this rocky, barren, prairie, savanna landscape in the White River Hills that it's just almost hard to believe it was like that. And you see it today, it's just a wall of cedar trees. And that was an incredible, rich grassland landscape historically. And we know that because we have this great data set from that original land survey I talked about, where they described every mile of land they crossed in detail. And I did a cool project. The cedar is native, as I mentioned, but probably historically, this is the kinds of things you'd see as far as cedar go. Giant old ones hanging on these bluff lines and crevices and cracks where fire would not burn or never got intense. Little fire breaks, naturally fire protected sites in the landscape. Ancient trees, sometimes 500 years old. But today they've just grown in. And this is a cool little exercise I did. I think I have a few more minutes to talk about comparing what you see today with these modern photographs with what the land surveyors saw 180 years ago. And it's pretty remarkable. So they would start here at the end of the zero on this green line, and they're walking north. It's a mile-long line. And they noted at this point, they encountered a post oak tree. PO is post oak. And then they entered the prairie at this point, and they came along and they described, the rest, that first part is barrens, which is their term for like an open savanna. And then the rest of that mile they described as rolling prairie with small spots of timber scattered through it. And today that's pretty well just wooded with cedar trees. And we've seen that just a million places up there. We could do this lots of places. Rolling prairie interspersed with timber, woods only along the creek. And then today it's just cedar thicket. Barrens interspersed with prairie, mostly rolling prairie, cedar trees. Rolling prairie, gravelly with scattering spots of timber, cedar trees. Woods again down along the stream, which is now under the lake. Pretty neat stuff. This is the glade map for Arkansas. That's 9 different types of glades mixed. I don't want to get the impression that the outline's been exaggerated. I don't want to give you the impression that most of Marion County is glades, because it's a smaller area than it seems, but it was blown up to show on the map. And here's the glades and prairies overlaying to give you an idea of where a lot of this open grassland was historically. And the glades are incredibly important biologically. They have so many endemic and globally rare species, things that are found only in a certain type of glade. These are 2 endemics to our dolomite glades, which is a type of limestone that's found in the White River Hills. And this is Trelease's larkspur and Bush's skullcap. They're found only in dolomite glades. Here is Ozark purple beard tongue, the yellow echinacea, and Bush's poppy mallow, also in dolomite glades and surrounding savannas. One of our rarest species on the federal endangered list is the Missouri bladderpod, Physaria filiformis. That's found in a single limestone glade site in Washington County on Beaver Lake, and a couple other places in the world. There it is there. That site up on, actually those ones in the Ouachita Mountains are being described as a new species to science. They're being split out from Missouri bladderpod. They're going to be the Ouachita bladderpod, meaning ours is even rarer, just at a few sites in North Arkansas and Southern Missouri. Glades are mini deserts. They have a desert fauna and flora. There's some very rare things that are odd to find. You find things like yucca. This is one of 4 species of native yucca that we have. in our glades and barrens. We've got some desert shrubs and desert succulents like this widow's cross on the lower right. We have 4 species of native prickly pear cactus in our glades. We have several other succulent species like this fame flower, rock pink, and what we call a eastern agave or false aloe. These are succulent plants that live in these dry, rocky glades. We have several desert fern species that live in the glades and some amazing insects. This is the lichen grasshopper. There's a lot of bare bedrock in a lot of our glades. It's covered with diverse lichen communities. And this is a grasshopper that's evolved to be absolutely perfectly camouflaged in the lichen. And when you see this thing land in a lichen patch, it just vanishes before your eyes. Absolutely amazing. It's the glade obligate species. I mentioned the northern collared or the eastern collared lizard, species of greatest conservation need in the Wildlife Action Plan. That is in our glades, as well as rare animals like the ground snake, found very rarely. I think it is in Benton County in some glades. The western diamondback rattlesnake reaches its eastern extent in our glades. We have lots of tarantulas in our glades, scorpions, and my favorite glade animal of all, the giant red-headed centipede. These get about 10 inches long. They're venomous. And I've seen these around Beaver Lake. Actually, that Missouri bladderpod site, I caught one time. People say, who would hold that in their hand? Well, just make sure it's eating a scorpion and you'll be fine. There's lots of southwestern flora as well in these. We found a lot of what we call disjunct species or far removed from their main range, like the cedar sedge, which occurs in glades in the White River Hills and otherwise is in like the Edwards Plateau of Texas. This is an amazing, I mentioned there were 4 prickly pear cactus native to Arkansas. We only had 3 that we knew of. And one day I was at Devil's Eyebrow on some tract, private land we were assessing, and I walked onto this glade and I found this gigantic cactus. It was scattered all out through the glade. The pads were about 8 to 10 inches across. The cactus was 3 feet tall. I didn't know what it was, but I knew without question it was new to Arkansas. And I got very excited about it, of course. Later, was able to work with an expert in cactus, and he told me what it was. It was this thing called Opuntia orbiculata. Actually, I think I have the wrong slide in here. We thought it was originally this thing, Lindheimer's prickly pear, but it turned out it was this other species. It wasn't even known from the region. It's known from Texas, Oklahoma, and clearly seems to be native in this habitat up in Benton County. These are the glade areas there. There's limestone glades, sort of in an area of extreme northwest Benton County, over around Sulphur Springs and Gravette. There's an area of limestone glades on Upper Beaver Lake. There's the big dolomite and limestone glades sort of mixed in the White River Hills around Beaver Lake. And there's the shale glades or barrens that we found down in the Bostons. And these were a natural community. It was not known to exist at all. This was sort of an unknown, undescribed, we were completely unaware of it. And they're pretty remarkable. I'm just skip ahead here. They're characterized by these shaly outcrops, very thin soil, glady vegetation, ancient post oak trees, blackjack oak trees. These particular trees here are about 250 years old. So pretty impressive. These are another more ancient post oak trees. This is on Kessler Mountain in Fayetteville, where there's some of these shale barrens. And then that's probably all I have time for. I'll just introduce bluffs and say that bluffs are another very important natural community with its own suite of very rare species that are found only in this habitat. There are actually several different kinds of habitats that make up most cliffs and bluffs. There's the face, there's the talus slope below with the loose rock, there's little glade ledges, different types of habitat with some very rare species. And that's another sort of hot spot, cliffs and ledges, steep slopes in the region I'm talking about. Get things like this Church's wild rye, which is globally rare, endemic to a small part of the interior highlands ecoregions. That does occur. This was new to science in 2006, which is also really cool. This grass was undescribed until that time. Pretty amazing area. And this one is another one that was thought to be gone from Arkansas. This is the Missouri ground cherry. It's a cliff and talus and glade species. And it was last seen in Northwest Arkansas, I think in the 1950s, and was able to relocate that at Kessler Mountain a few years ago, and then found it at Devil's Eyebrow just a couple years ago. So pretty neat. We're still finding important discoveries of globally rare things and new species to science through this work. We have other species on bluffs that are found in the West. This is something that was found recently in Washington County by Karen Willard, one of our contract botanists. This is something disjunct from the Rocky Mountains, but it's on cliffs in the Boston. And then another new species to science, Ozark Leatherwood. This is a shrub that was new to science a couple years ago, and that's found in on cliffs around. It is in Benton County, at least historically, around Beaver Lake on the cliffs. And then forests are a natural thing as well. It's not all savannas and woodlands. In the more protected areas and steep slopes and rugged hollows, we do have natural forest communities, several types, these mesic forests, and they have their own suite of rare elements. You find things like ginseng, some of these rare lilies, some of these wild Appalachian disjunct species like this Bowman's root, which was recently found near Pea Ridge National Park. Black maple down at Devil's Eyebrow. Rare things like this white rattlesnake root. A lot of these things have northern or Appalachian affinities, things like Kentucky lady slipper. And then I'll just end with a few woodland shots of what we would like to restore a lot of these closed woodlands to look like. We know how to do this. It's not hard. It takes a lot of hard work, but it's not difficult to do in terms of a concept. And we can restore a lot of the biological diversity that we've lost around these grasslands by opening the remaining woodlands around them. And that's something that we do a lot of, and we encourage our partners to as well. Be happy to answer questions if there's time, and even take them via email later if needed. Thank you.